Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Mein Name ist Eric Frey von der Tageszeitung Der Standard. Der Standard ist eines der Trägerinnen dieser Diskussionsreihe Europa im Diskurs, Debating Europe, gemeinsam mit dem Institut für die Wissenschaften von Menschen, dem IWM, der Erste Stiftung und dem Burgtheater. Und im Namen aller dieser Organisationen möchte ich Sie heute ganz, ganz herzlich hier begrüßen und mich bedanken, dass ihr hier an diesem schönen Tag hierher gekommen seid, ins Burgtheater. Wie Sie alle wissen, es ist ein großes Wahljahr heuer. Auch wir in Österreich haben noch zwei sehr wichtige Wahlen, die uns bevorstehen. Aber wahrscheinlich gibt es keine Wahl, die ganz viele Menschen so sehr bewegt und so sehr beschäftigt wie die am 5. November stattfinden wird in den USA, die amerikanische Präsidentenwahl. Und als wir über den Plan dieses Jahres im vergangenen Herbst, das Programm dieser Serie gesprochen haben, hat Misha Glenny, der Direktor vom IWM, der auch heute die Diskussion moderieren wird, sofort gesagt, wir müssen noch vor dem Sommer einmal über die USA diskutieren. Das tun wir heute und dass es unter dem Label Europa im Diskurs stattfindet, passt sehr gut, weil es ist Europa ganz, ganz stark betroffen von dem, was in den USA passieren wird. Es geht um das Überleben der Ukraine, es geht um die Zukunft des westlichen Bündnisses, der NATO, es geht auch um ganz entscheidende Fragen der internationalen Wirtschaftsordnung. Und das wird das Hauptthema heute sein, glaube ich, dass auf diesem Podium von einer sehr hochqualifizierten Runde diskutiert wird in englischer Sprache. Ich kann mich in meiner Jugend erinnern, als noch der Kalte Krieg herrschte, da wurde vor amerikanischen Präsidentenwahlen oft gesagt, eigentlich sollten wir Europäer auch eine Stimme haben, weil es uns so stark betrifft. Und das trifft heute mehr zu denn je. Wie Sie alle wissen, die meisten von hier können nicht wählen, aber wir können darüber diskutieren, wir können darüber schreiben und wir können da auch am 5. November und am 6. November mit zittern, was in den USA dort passiert und mitfiebern. Diese heutige Diskussion ist die letzte unter der Kuschai-Ära. Und ich möchte mich an dieser Stelle ganz herzlich bei Martin Kuschai und seinem Team bedanken, der uns die letzten vergangenen 5 Jahre hier ständig und stark unterstützt hat. Und wir haben diese Europa im Diskurs Diskussionen auch in Zeiten gemacht, wo es sehr, sehr herausfordernd war, nämlich mitten in der Pandemie, wo man keine Karten verkaufen konnte und haben es trotzdem weiterhin durchgetragen. Und es freut mich auch zu sagen, dass es auch in der Ära Bachmann fortgesetzt werden wird und schon bereits in diesem Herbst wir eine weitere Diskussion haben werden, die sich mit der österreichischen politischen Situation auch nach den Wahlen beschäftigen wird. Und wenn man bedenkt, dass das dann bereits die 5. Direktion sein wird, unter der Europa im Diskurs Debating Europe stattfindet, ist das schon eine sehr, sehr lange Zeit, 16 Jahre, die wir das gemacht haben. Man könnte sagen, das ist eines der ältesten Stücke im Repertoire des Burgtheaters, the longest running show on the Burg vielleicht. Und in diesem Sinne, weil wir uns dann wiedersehen werden, will ich Ihnen jetzt sagen, auf Wiedersehen und ich wünsche Ihnen eine sehr, sehr gute, interessante Diskussion heute Vormittag.
Hello and welcome to the Burgtheater, to this season's 3rd and final event in the Debating Europe series. I'm Misha Glenny and I'm the rector of the IWM, the IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences. But before I tee up today's discussion, I'd like to introduce my eminent guests on the panel who will be considering the forthcoming US presidential elections and their impact on Europe in particular. So in alphabetical order, over to my left, to your right, we have Kim Darroch, or Lord Darroch of Kew, to give him his honorific title. He was one of Britain's most experienced diplomats until his resignation from the Foreign Office almost 5 years ago, having served in several key positions for the United Kingdom government, such as National Security Advisor and as both the UK's permanent representative to the European Union, but I hasten to add that was sometime before Brexit, as well as the UK's ambassador to Washington. Now, he resigned this latter post after the leaking of confidential diplomatic correspondence in which he described the Trump administration as, among other things, inept and insecure. And those who would like further details of this should read his riveting account of the affair in his book, Collateral Damage, Britain, America, and Europe in the Age of Trump. Next to me, to my left, is Professor Marlène Laruelle. She is a research professor of international affairs and political science and director of the Illiberalism Studies program at George Washington, GW University in Washington, D.C. Although I'm very pleased to say that at the moment she is a fellow of the Institute for Human Sciences here in Vienna. Her scholarship has focused on post-Soviet political, social, and cultural developments with a particular emphasis on ideologies and nationalism. However, she is a close political observer of her native France, unsurprisingly, and is a senior associate scholar at the Institut Français des Relations Internationales. Then we have over to my far right, Mark Medish. Mark is a Washington-based lawyer and policy consultant who served under President Clinton in the US Treasury, on the National Security Council, and at the State Department. At the National Security Council, he was Senior Director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian Affairs. But he's also the founding director of Keep Our Republic, which has a website, and I highly recommend it. It's a civic education organization which, among other things, monitors the constitutionality of contemporary politics in the United States. And full disclosure here, Mark is also a board member of the Institute for Human Sciences. He's a polyglot and boasts Danish citizenship as well as American. And last, but by no means least, Dr. Eva Nowotny, who requires perhaps the least introduction here in Vienna. She was foreign policy advisor to two Austrian chancellors, Fred Sinowatz and Franz Vranitzky, which is when I first met her in the 1980s. But she went on to serve as Austria's ambassador to France, to the United Kingdom, before playing a key policy role during Austria's early years as a member of the EU. And then, of course, for 5 years, she was Austria's ambassador to Washington, D.C. And although she subsequently retired from the Foreign Service, she remains one of the most active voices in foreign policy institutes and debates here in Vienna. That's our panel for this morning. Thank you. So, no US presidential election, certainly in my memory, has generated as much trepidation and interest as the one awaiting us in November this year. The outcome of the battle between the two men of advancing age who have both served as president will have an immense impact on political stability, not just in America, but of course around the world, and that's why we're here. Their approaches and style could hardly be more different, whether in the economy, whether in domestic policy, foreign policy, security issues. Messrs. Trump and Biden promise radically different visions of the immediate future. Now, I think it's around 160 million American voters, that's 2% of the world's population, will make a decision that will likely impact on all 8 billion people around the world. But before we look at the specific concerns of Europe regarding this election, which will be the focus of our discussions, I want to ask our sole American on the panel, Mark Medish, what is at stake domestically in both constitutional and political terms in the United States at this election. Mark, where are we in America?
Well, thank you very much, Misha. Real honor to be part of this distinguished panel. And what a great audience on a sunny day in Vienna. We have a very cloudy subject to talk about, and we're living in a very stormy world, but it's a beautiful day in Vienna. You must excuse me, but I was educated by Jesuits, and we were taught to think and to speak in threes. And it was more of a practical matter than a spiritual one. So I'm going to share a few thoughts in groups of three. First off, three very general observations, obiter dicta. You know, there's an old saying that when America sneezes, Europe catches cold. And I think the question for all of us is, what if the US has long COVID? What happens to Europe? What kind of contagion might we see? Second general observation is, don't underestimate the magnitude, the scale, the complexity, and the volatility of the challenges our societies face internally and externally today. Be prepared for the unexpected. Third, never underestimate the capacity of the United States to adapt. If America is one thing as a body politic, it is resilient. It's always a mistake, in my view, to bet against America. But that said, we might have long COVID. And that brings me to my second grouping of three, which is big questions in the US historical perspective that will be answered in large part by the outcome of the election in 2024. And the first question is really, was Barack Obama an anomaly, an aberration, or was Trump the aberration? Because they're poles apart in terms of what they represent in political culture. And Obama was not so long ago. Second, these are all related. Can Biden maintain the center? Will the center hold? Or will the Biden term as president prove to be an entr'acte, an intermission between other things, other bigger things? And finally, were the events of January 6th an exception or a dress rehearsal for something yet to come? My third group of three, and I should say, with respect to these last questions, the very fact that we're asking them reflects the degree of uncertainty in the United States and therefore in the world today. And that has consequences, because the US used to be seen as a rather predictable player, and that is far less the case today. Third group of three, key aspects of the current context in the US. And I'll put it very simply. We have smarter machines, we have angrier people, and we have nastier enemies. Smarter machines, we're swimming in an ocean of disinformation, deep fakes. The chaos that social media is wreaking on our political conversation is profound. Angrier people, the degree of polarization and tribalism in politics, the level of rage and emotion is quite unprecedented, or at least remindful in the US of the 1960s, the level of social unrest during the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam. And then nastier enemies. I don't need to remind you about all of the strife in the world today, but I'll name three: Ukraine, Gaza, the risk of war with China. And there are others. My fourth group of three, the levels of analysis of the 2024 contest and what it means. The first way you can look at it is as a horse race. Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. These are the presumptive candidates. They haven't been formally picked yet. That happens later in the summer, but they are the presumptive nominees of their parties. The horse race means who's up, who's down, and why, according to the polling. But an important caveat on polling: don't trust the polls. They are a necessary tool, but they're a limited tool. There's a great deal of volatility in the polling. There's a great deal of contradictory information in the polling. And the only poll that really matters is what happens in early November, who actually shows up to vote. In the last election, 2020, voter turnout in America was almost 70%, which is unheard of. It was the highest level in a century, and no pollster could have foreseen that. And of course, voter turnout has an enormous impact on how things ultimately play out. Secondly, the election was ultimately determined because of our very peculiar system of the Electoral College, where states, the counting of the states is what matters. That election was determined ultimately by about 43,000 votes in 3 states. If those had moved in a different direction, or if others had voted, we could have had a different outcome. No poll can capture that level of specificity. We can also talk about what the so-called wedge issues are in the election that we know about. Migration, inflation, Gaza. We've seen the campus protests that are unfolding. We can get to those, Misha, up to you. The next part of this 3-level analysis is actual outcomes. And here what's important, there really are only 3 possibilities. A clear win for Biden, a clear win for Trump, or a close election. America has had 4 exceedingly close elections in the last quarter century. 2000, Bush v. Gore, famous one. 2004 was actually very close. It came down to 1 state in the Electoral College. That was Kerry versus Bush. Bush won. And then, of course, Hillary versus Trump in 2016 and the last election. So if we're headed for a close election, watch out, because at least one of the candidates wants to obtain power any way he can. And we saw what they were willing to do on January 6th. Some people would even say a rolling coup is underway, that the stage is being set for a contested election in November. In other words, a disagreement about who won, and then a further fight for the White House. Final level analysis is implications for the world of all of this, the policy implications. And here, I mean, basically, if Biden wins, you can expect him to continue with what we've seen, an attempt to balance objectives in a very conflictual world. If Trump comes back to power, we will see a new version, an updated version of his nationalism, isolationism, transactional approach to international affairs. There are commonalities, and one that many people are talking about is policy on China. It is one area where there's a strong bipartisan consensus in the US that we need to take a tougher line on China. So that may be something very predictable regardless of who wins. My final set of 3 are my 3 envois, or takeaways. And they are hope for Biden, prepare for Trump, or hope for Trump, prepare for Biden, if that's your political cup of tea. It's not mine, but another one is hope for Biden, prepare for Harris, because Biden is not young, and many actuarial tables predict that he might not be able to fulfill a second term. Who knows? In which case his vice president would become president. And finally, hope for a different choice in November. The majority of Americans actually would love to have a different choice. Both men are quite unpopular, and the choice is unpopular. But don't expect it. There are still things that could happen at the convention, and as you may have noticed, Donald Trump has some legal problems. So all of this suggests that we're going to have to think of how Europe might avoid long COVID, if that's what the US indeed has. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So Marlène, let's go over to you and say, is Europe preparing for long COVID? And as far as I can see, one of the few people who's actively articulating strategies, in particular for a Trump presidency, is Emmanuel Macron. Is Macron the only person who's thinking about this? What does he think Europe ought to do? And are other European leaders basically engaging with his concerns?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for the invitation. I will also try to go by 3, then to follow that tradition. So, first point, since the UK left EU, France became the only full military, including nuclear power, inside the EU. And that has kind of accelerated the strategic thinking in Paris. There was already this vision seen from the French perspective of kind of the Gaullist tradition of being very cautious toward the US, trying to push for more autonomous, unified European defense policy. But the current experience with the first Trump presidency and the potentiality of a second one has kind of accelerated in the thinking, and Macron has kind of taken the lead, and we saw that at the end of February when he made this first kind of half-cooked declaration about the possibility of the risk of having to send troops to Ukraine, which was a way to try to kind of wake up the European policy circle by saying that, well, first Trump could be elected in November, but even if he's not elected, look at the paralyzed Congress that we have in the US. So in any case, the US is no more a kind of reliable partner for European security. But as you said, Misha, I think it's a much more kind of long-term, or at least medium-term, strategic vision coming from France, which is that whatever will be happening in November, the US is kind of drifting apart from European security on a series of issues. China is one, Indo-Pacific is another one. And so the French vision is that, okay, if Biden is elected, it can be good for European security, but that doesn't change the kind of long-term issues. If Trump is elected, then the issues, the tension is arriving now. So the kind of long-term strategy is how we try to build this European defense policy. And his statement a few days ago about saying that France is ready to open a debate about the potentiality of having the French nuclear power becoming part of the European defense policy, meaning that potentially the French nuclear power will work as an umbrella for the whole of Europe and not only the US nuclear umbrella, is a kind of way to try to open that debate. Is that working well or not? I think we all have kind of mixed feeling on the ways messaging has been working. The Central European countries are the ones who have been always the most ambitious in terms of trying to build a European defense policy, but they rely very much on the US. They are not pro-European, they are pro-US and pro-NATO on many aspects. So that doesn't fit the French perspective. Germany would be, of course, the obvious partner, but Germany is in a kind of difficult transition in terms of strategic vision, and here also France had the feeling of not having a German partner at the level. And then there is also kind of hidden strategic element, which are that when we talk about building a unified, autonomous European defense policy, do we mean just increasing state budget for the military and buying US equipment, which is more or less what the US is kind of saying when they push for NATO countries to spend more money on their defense? Or is that what would be the French vision, which would be that we can have a unified defense policy only if we have a unified and growing European military industrial market, meaning we would buy military equipment to European firms and no more to the US. So in that case, there is an economic competition with the US, which is kind of hidden subtext of that discussion. And if I remember, last kind of third point is that we are looking at what is happening in the US, but we also have similar transformation of our political landscape here in Europe. And the European election in early June will be also showing the kind of transformation that we are facing in Europe. And here also, I mean, the polls and the surveys should be taken with caution, but we have like 9 countries where the far right will be leading in election and 9 other countries where the far right will be second or third in the European election. That still make 2/3 of European countries where you will have very strong far right represented at the European Parliament, which also means that on our side, we will have more and more politicians who can be in tune ideologically with Donald Trump in case he is elected, right? So it's not only that the US is getting transformed, we are also getting transformed. That said, it doesn't mean that if we have growing European far right in power, we still have the same language as Trump in terms of foreign policy and in terms of the way we look at a European future and especially the war in Ukraine. It's also important to see the differences in terms of political project. And I think, as you were mentioning, the radicality of the Trump project is really of kind of transforming radically US institution in case he's elected. The European far right has a much more normalized or mainstream narrative and policy. Doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact, but it's still of a totally different scale in terms of the kind of earthquake it could kind of produce. So I think France is trying to at least launch a public space where the debates and everything that was taboo until then can be put on the table. Does that work? And does France feel it has enough kind of European support? I don't think so.
Picking up on that, Kim Darroch, I know that you recently wrote an article entitled What Europe Should Do in the Event of a Trump Presidency. You have, of course, experience not only of Washington, the United States, and Europe, but also you have closely observed the impact of Brexit on British policy. With that fragmentation in mind, and given that Europe itself appears to be fragmenting, what is it that Europe can do concretely to protect itself against the fallout from a Trump presidency? And what do you see as the main dangers there?
Thank you, Misha, and thank you for the invitation. This is a wonderful event. First of all, an apology. I'm afraid I look at my rather cursory notes, and none of my points are arranged in threes, so you'll just have to deal with them as they come out. Second, a few words about the state of the UK, my home country. Look, there are lots of underlying strengths still in the UK, but there is no getting away from the reality that we are in quite a difficult moment just now. Some of our most important domestic policies, notably on health, but also on infrastructure, to some extent on education, are in something of a crisis. The economy has grown very slowly, if at all, for the last few years. Surely not by coincidence. It's grown slowly ever since Brexit. And we have an election coming up at the latest by January, but much more likely to be either this summer or more likely than that, I think, in the early autumn, let's say October or November. So this is a moment both of some pressure on the government, which is some 20 points behind in the opinion polls. So the likelihood that the Conservatives, after 4 election victories, will now give way to a centre-left Labour government looks quite high. And a moment when whichever government comes in after that election faces some really challenging problems on issues like health, as I say, and education and infrastructure. And there is very little money to go around because the economy just isn't growing fast enough to generate funds for the government, any government, to throw money at all this. So it is a difficult moment, a challenging moment. We've been through them before. But on top of that, you now have the world in turmoil, Gaza, Ukraine, the threat from China, and you have this election in the US, which of course affects all of us. And let's just look at the scenario of what if Trump wins. First point, which I dismiss, is there going to be any special treatment for the UK because of our special relationship with the United States? And the answer to that would be, it's very unlikely. I was in the US for most of Trump's first term. He introduced tariffs on European aluminium, European steel, no exemptions for the UK. Of course, we went and said to the Americans, well, come on, we're your best friends, you know. Surely we should get some sort of deal here. but there wasn't one. I don't think Trump is at all sentimental about the special relationship, and so I think we would be treated in the same way as the rest of Europe, with one exception, which is, of course, now that we're out of the European Union, we're going to feel a bit isolated, I think, floating somewhere mid-Atlantic between the European Union and the United States, without that sort of protective umbrella of being part of the EU if we get into a difficult, challenging set of trade tariffs and counter-tariffs and so on, or if you go into a situation where whoever is in the White House is putting a lot of pressure on European allies to do more, to be tougher on China, and if you're not part of that 28-country grouping in the EU, that pressure is just going to feel that bit stronger and that bit more intense. So my own conclusion about a very basic thing that we need to do over the next year, 18 months, is develop a stronger relationship with Europe, which is not about rejoining, not even rejoining the single market or the customs union, but it's about doing something like, and this is, by the way, a priority of the Labour opposition, a security and foreign policy structured relationship with the EU. It's already there in quite an unstructured way, but a structure that would give us regular context, more process, more information exchanged, more cooperation and coordination would, I think, be a good thing. And it wouldn't surprise me, actually, if even if the Conservatives win, looks unlikely at the moment, they go down that path as well. So we will need to get closer to Europe in the next 18 months. That's a kind of big picture thing. If you look at the Trump policies, and these are all out there in his own speeches and in briefings by his team that are going to affect Europe, let's start with Ukraine, where he says that he will stop the war on the first day of his presidency, essentially by forcing Zelensky and Putin to do a deal. My own feeling is the only deal that is conceivable would be one in which basically the Russians keep at least the territory that they have gained already through their illegal offensive, and potentially it's a deal where Putin actually asks for rather more territory than that, and Zelensky says no. So I think I don't see any mileage in this Trump idea. But part of it, of course, is he will stop U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Now we've just had, at long last, $60 billion package agreed in the US Congress, but not without months and months of difficulty. And remember, it's not just a few, as it were, rogue congressmen. A lot of the Republican voting base thinks too much American aid is being given to Ukraine and that money should be spent domestically. So I think it is credible, indeed likely, that Trump would indeed stop US military aid to Ukraine, and this time with no chance of Congress eventually coming around to it and approving it, because you wouldn't sign the ensuing legislation. So what do we do this year? First of all, that American $60 billion package has to get to Ukraine as quickly as possible, and I think that's already the intention of the US administration. But second, there is a real challenge for Europe to reach a position where they can do a lot more. And that means, principally, I think, going to European arms, ammunition and shell manufacturers and saying you need to really increase your production levels over the next 6 months, 12 months, so we can backfill some of what America won't be supplying if it comes to that. And I think actually that's already happening. I think NATO countries are approaching their domestic arms producers. But it takes a long time, maybe 12 months, to set up a new production line if you're going to double your production of this. And companies say, well, what if you then get a deal in Ukraine and this is all money we've wasted? So it's not easy, this, but it's kind of, I think, essential. Remember, we have spent almost $200 billion, euros, trying to save Ukraine from this Russian invasion so far. It will be a huge strategic level defeat for Europe if the Russians eventually succeed there, if the Ukrainians lose this war. So that's my number one priority, and that means a really big task for Europe to prepare for the possibility that Trump both wins and that he does stop aid to Ukraine. Second issue, NATO. You all know what Trump has said publicly about any country that isn't spending 2% of GDP on defense, any NATO country. He would say to Putin, do whatever you like with those countries or to those countries. And he does mean this. He means it for two reasons. One, he resents deeply that America spends so much on defense, and so much of that is to protect Europe. And second, he doesn't really believe in in American interventionism to make the world a better place. He is genuinely an isolationist. So it's not just about the money that Europe is spending, but we're not going to get to first base with them unless we do better. The moment I think about 12 NATO countries are at 2%. The expectation is by the end of the year, it's going to be more like 18. That still leaves close to a dozen countries not there. Everyone needs to step up and do more on this if we are going to keep an America led by Trump committed to NATO. Third thing, very, very briefly, trade. The Trump team say, when they come in, 10% tariffs on all American imports from the rest of the world. Not just steel and aluminium, everything. And by the way, also 60% tariffs on all Chinese exports to the US. Let's just deal with the 10%. That's quite a hit. I think it's economically illiterate because actually tariffs mean American consumers just pay more for their goods, but it's very damaging to the global trading system, and I think it potentially triggers off another wave of international inflation, and it's bad for the global economy. But the other thing I think that is inevitable is the EU will want to respond to that. You might call it retaliation. They responded to the tariffs on aluminium and steel in Trump's first term. They'll have to respond to that. And for the UK, we will need to think, where do we sit on this? Are we going to go with Europe in putting our own tariffs on American imports to the UK? Or do we sit somewhere in the mid-Atlantic just deciding what to do and not knowing quite what to do there? And then finally, China, as I mentioned, whoever is in the White House, there is going to be pressure on Europe to be tougher on China and maybe to go down the track of tariffs on China or restrictions on Chinese students or more efforts to stop Chinese espionage. There's lots of bad things the Chinese do that we need to respond to. We're not very effective at so far. And that pressure will come on whoever is in the White House, I think. And again, for the UK, we need to work out where we're going to stand on this, whether we stand with what might be a rather reluctant Europe to go as far as the American administration will want us to, or whether we throw our lot fully in with the US. Remember, there are some bits of British industry, I look at the car industry and Jaguar Land Rover in particular, that are massively dependent on the Chinese market. So there is real pain for us somewhere down the track, economic pain, if we go down that route. So these are things which, discreetly, we could be preparing for in foreign ministries around Europe now, and I hope we are. I hope that the clever people in policy planning teams around Europe are thinking about this. Maybe it won't happen, but we don't want to be in a panic the day after Trump wins the election in November, thinking, oh, what do we do now if all of these things actually happen? Some of them may not. Some of them may be, Trump may get dissuaded by whatever team he assembles in his cabinet to do some of these things. But I don't think he's a man who changes his mind easily. That's the evidence of his first term. He can be delayed on doing things, but at the end he always comes back to them, and therefore Europe needs to be ready.
Thanks, Kim. So in that case, let me turn to Eva Nowotny. Do you know whether European foreign ministries have got these planning operations in place, trying to work out what happens after Trump? Austria, of course, as we know, is not a NATO country. It's neutral. There's some argue that it's received some protection by being surrounded by NATO. But what are Austria's vital interests in the event of a Trump presidency, and what would the Austrian policy planning team be advising Brussels to do in the event of a Trump presidency?
These are very loaded questions for somebody who is no longer actively involved in the decision-making in the government processes. Nevertheless, let me try to answer at least a bit of it. It is redundant probably in this public, but nevertheless I will make the point that whatever happens, Austria as a member of the European Union is tied into the common decision-making of the European Union. So whatever happens on the level of transatlantic relations, on the overall structure, Austria will be tied into this process. That does not mean that we do not have our own bilateral interest also with the United States. We have a long common history, we have manifold relations, not only security relations, but human relations, economic relations, it goes on cultural relations, it goes on many different levels. And we have always tried, knowing also with a kind of national modesty that we are not the most important player in Washington in the whole foreign policy scope of the United States, but still that there is a little Austrian star blinking on the American radar. That is important. I would invite you to a brief sort of experiment, but reflect for a moment how the last 75 years of European history and Austrian history as well might have evolved were it not for the US involvement in European affairs. We would be in a completely different situation. And that's why the transatlantic relations per se are so important for us and for Europe. Yeah? Now, the first Trump presidency has had an enormous impact because it was for the first time that we were confronted with an American politician who described the European Union not as a partner or a competitor or a friend even, but he said outspokenly, it is an enemy. And that was a shock throughout Europe. He called Brussels a hellhole. Yeah? So there was this element of contempt, of not only misunderstanding, but of contempt for European development, for European politics. The Biden administration brought things back to a more even keel. And I think Biden is probably the American politician at the moment with the longest foreign policy experience and also perspective. I mean, the way we have seen how he operates in the Ukraine, how he operates in the Middle East issues, very circumspect, very careful, not sort of rushing in with extraordinary statements. He's a man who is very thoughtful and deliberating in what he's going to do and what he's going to say. So things were in the transatlantic relationship back to a more or less even keel. And the prospect that we might get a second Trump administration has shaken Europe deeply. And a lot of thinking is going on how we are going to cope, yeah? Because it's not only, we are fixating also a little bit in this debate on the two personalities. We are fixating on Trump, we are fixating on Biden. But this election goes much deeper. There's an election, this is the whole of the House of Representatives, 2/3 of the American Senate. And it might very well turn out that this is brings about a shift in the general American political system, which will sort of force us to cope with a completely different landscape. In contrary to the first Trump presidency, this one is extremely well prepared. And this is also something that we are not perhaps carefully looking at. There is a blueprint being worked out under the title of Project 25, where a number, and this is not only one institution, but a number of American institutions and think tanks have collaborated in establishing the procedures and the blueprint for the next 4 years. Because they have learned the lesson of the first presidency, where so much chaos and so much wrong decision-making was happening. They are preparing, and we are. They have also compiled a data bank of about 20,000 people who are willing to come into the administration, fulfill the jobs in the different ministries that are going to be empty, and they will all come with this blueprint in their pocket. So it will be we will be very well advised to have to have a clearer perspective of what Europe might do when it really comes to this point. I strongly believe that whatever happens, Europe will be best. So it will be in the best interest of Europe to maintain good relations to Washington, whatever happens. Yeah. And it will not be easy. It will be a lot of negotiating, a lot of backbending, and so on will probably be involved. But the two sides of the Atlantic are tied together in so many aspects that economically, politically, security-wise, that it would be a disaster not only for us in Europe, for us as Austrians, but also for global affairs, that if this relationship would really enter a sphere of deep-seating troubles and problems.
So it strikes me from our first round, I picked up a couple of things, and in this second round, I want us to become more conversational, as it were. So I'm going to ask the panelists, they can interrupt and intervene if they feel so inclined. There are two things. First of all, as Kim put it, and as Eva has just underlined, Trump means it. That this is a more focused, serious Trump presidency, yes, if he gets in than we've had before. The second thing that most of you have mentioned is China. And of course, the peculiarity of China is that there's largely bipartisan consensus in the US about the policy on China. And so, two things. Mark, Trump means it. What does that mean for you in the United States? And on the China question, is Europe going to be squeezed? Kim, you mentioned the British automotive industry and its the importance of the Chinese market, but Germany, this is an absolutely huge issue. So is Europe squeezed either way? And how serious is that phrase, Trump's means it?
Misha, I do think Trump means it, but I'm not sure he knows what it means. And it's actually one of his skills as a politician. He is an extremely adept communicator, but in an unorthodox way. It does not conform to what the American establishment was used to. He deviates from the grammar and the style of traditional American politicians. But that doesn't mean he's not effective. He does connect with masses of the population. He has strong support. He has intense supporters. I do agree with Eva completely. One should take seriously the planning that is being done. It's public. They publish reports, the Heritage Foundation report that was just mentioned. It's very detailed. Most of it is on domestic policy, not on foreign policy. They are preparing cadres because they understood that while they won the election last time, they sort of failed. They won power, but they failed to take power because they failed to populate the administration with enough implementers. And this is what Trump refers to as the deep state. He says that he became president, but the deep state resisted him. This time they want to repopulate the government. So it is a very deliberate approach. I think the distinctive feature that worries me most about Trump, even if he doesn't know what he means, is he implies decisionism. He implies just do it is the right thing, rather than thinking about consequences. And that plays into what I would call an authoritarian temptation that haunts many of our societies right now. I think that's a demon we have to worry about, that people become curious. They're frustrated with democracy. Results don't come quickly enough or predictably enough. So why don't we try something else? And if I may, on China,
yeah, on China,
it's going to get worse. So be prepared. And this could come from a second Biden administration as well. For example, electric vehicles. You have a lot of analysts now saying that the risk of Chinese electric vehicles is not just that they're being dumped, subsidized, and it's unfair competition, but electric vehicles are actually information-gathering devices. They are like our cell phones. So if you were worried about Huawei, you also have to be worried about EVs because they are intelligence-gathering devices.
Eva.
I just wanted to pick up on what Marcus said before he started talking about China, about the danger of authoritarianism. Personally, and I don't hesitate to say that, I'm not at all 100% sure that Trump is going to win this election. Yeah, I think Biden has a very good chance of emerging a second time as defeating Trump. We will see how that happens. But whatever happens with Trump, we have to be aware of the danger that this shift in the American government is going to be like a breath of oxygen for all the populist, authoritarian movements throughout Europe. Yeah? And that is, in my opinion, a very, very big danger that we have in all European countries. We have seen now, for instance, the message that Trump sent to the Conservative Action Committee meeting in Budapest.
Yeah.
Embracing Orban, embracing the political style of Orban, and so on. So this is going to have an enormous impact on Europe, on domestic politics in many European countries, and also in connection to the outcome of the European elections now. Yeah.
Yes, you're seeing a lot of that under the radar, those relationships being built up, even with such wacky characters as Liz Truss, now engaging with the sort of far right network that's emerging. But Marlène, on that China issue, Europe hasn't decided what its relationship with China should be. It wants to engage. It sometimes is worried about what happens to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. It's caught between a sort of commitment to human rights, a need for the trading relationship with China, and an unease about the United States military presence in East Asia in the event that all blows up. What should Europe be thinking? And this is really either with a second Biden presidency or a Trump presidency. What should Europe's policy be on China?
Well, I think the key issue is that it's a more systemic issue, is that Europe wasn't able to emerge as a kind of unified geopolitical and economic superpower. And so we are kind of sandwiched between the US and China. And of course, we may have more interest as siding with the US on many aspects than with China, but there is this feeling that there is no good solution for Europe until Europe is able to kind of overcome its own internal issues and lack of unities. And so you have divergent foreign policy depending of European countries toward China, but I think the structural issues, it's the EU itself capacity to imagine itself as a superpower, maybe not at the level of the US of China, but to think of itself as being autonomous for the two of them. And that process, I think, is in the making, but unfortunately, we are late on many aspects. We are late on many technologies, and so we find ourselves in a situation where technologies are changing so fast that we are kind of running after what the Chinese and the Americans are doing, and we are kind of limited ourselves in the capacity to imagine what this Europe will be. So I think the China policy of the EU is really linked to this kind of systemic absence of Europe as a kind of unified geopolitical entity. And if I may just add on what is happening in the US, I think really we should be moving away from this vision we have of Trump as a populist, which was a 2016 vision, to understand that what is happening now with this project 2025, it's the institutionalization of Trumpism as an ideology and as a policy project, right? So it's a totally different, so we may still look at Trump as a kind of actor, as a showman, right? But behind him, there is a whole group of people. Trump may not know what he means, but there are people who are there for him to kind of build that strategy. And even if Biden will be winning, we will still have half of the Americans who will be voting for Trump, who will be disappointed. There will be insurrection, there will be street violence, there will be some states which will refuse to recognize the result of the election. There will be pressure at the county level, so there will be this kind of atmosphere of civil war. I'm not saying there will be civil war, but there will be something in the atmosphere of really a country kind of falling apart in terms of public opinion, and that will have an impact on, as we said, on the US foreign policy, because even if Biden is elected, he will be limited in what he can do. And as Eva was saying, the impact on Europe will be really huge, because we also have, even if our own kind of far rights have a different political project that is less radical than the one that Trump is pushing now, there will be resonance, and so there will be waves kind of arriving in Europe that will be very strong, in any case, Biden or Trump elected.
Kim.
Just on your China point, Misha, reminds me of UK National Security Council sort of 2013, 2014. And you had, this was the Cameron government, George Osborne, Chancellor, and there were regular discussions about relations with China. Our own UK relations with China were in a bad state at the time, because David Cameron had dared to see the Dalai Lama when he was in the UK, and the Chinese basically broke all top-level political contacts with us for about 18 months. And the discussion around the National Security Council table was about the economic opportunity that we were missing. And we noted that Angela Merkel took a delegation of senior German businessmen to China every year. And Germany exported 5 times as much to China as we did. And Germany's economy is bigger than ours, but it's not 5 times bigger. And I cannot conceal there was a great deal of envy about how well other European countries were doing in comparison with us, and how much that benefited their economies. And we repaired the relationship with China. We entered into a golden era, which actually was quite brief, like about 2.5 years or so. It all fell apart again. But some British companies started doing then, and are still doing very well in China. But essentially it was about competition between European countries to exploit the economic opportunities, commercial opportunities in China. And we now have a lot of pressure coming on already from the United States, but there will be a lot more over the next few years about responding to China's espionage against our secrets, about the number of Chinese students we're taking in, about unfair Chinese trade practices and the difficulties it is in exporting China, about China's policies on climate change, China's policies towards their neighbors, Taiwan, and so on, lots of things. But essentially for most European countries, the economic benefits of being in with China and trading with them outweigh those concerns. So there is no European position, with or without the UK and the EU, there's no real concerted, tough UK position on, EU position on China. And as long as that's the case, the Chinese will exploit, will divide and rule, and the Americans will find Europeans wanting when it comes to, will you put pressure on China over this or this or this? So you don't get anywhere with China unless you are united. If we were united in Europe, again, with or without the US, Europe's very, very powerful. And China is a trade-based economy, and they desperately need for economic growth in China to have a good trading relationship with Europe. So there is leverage there if we work together. But we're a long way from working together, and the UK has been, frankly, as bad as anyone in seeing China more in terms of commercial economic opportunity than in terms of a challenge and a threat.
Right. So there's a pattern emerging here about the fragmentation of Europe and European political structures, making it less well prepared for whatever the outcome of the presidency is. You, Kim, have mentioned Ukraine. I'd like to bring in the others on Ukraine. Mark, what's yours? You worked on Ukraine in the 1990s in the National Security Council. How disastrous is Ukraine for Europe at the moment and post the presidential election?
Let me go back to how Kim phrased it earlier, because I think it's very important. We just saw historic cooperation in the U.S. Congress to pass the aid package, not only for Ukraine, but Israel and other matters. This was important because, as you know, the House of Representatives is controlled by the Republicans. And so the White House and the House were having extreme difficulty moving this forward. And what was required is that Democrats had to cross over and vote with House Republicans. And this is important because it's an example of how the center can hold. And we need to look for more signs of that going forward. This is really how it's going to play out. Can that centrism, can that spirit of compromise be achieved? Will we have a politics of compromise? That's the strength of democracy. Differences, democracy is all about differences. Democracy is a conflict management scheme about managing differences. The opposite politics is one of total conflict, and that is what Trump seems to be a proponent of. That's where the radicalism lies. So Ukraine was one of the hostages to this battle, and people like me think it was absolutely outrageous to keep Ukraine in suspense. And you can disagree about whether it would be desirable ultimately to have some kind of ceasefire talks. I mean, wars end often with negotiations, so we can't pretend this is the first war. Most of the major wars one knows about have ended with peace talks that are unsatisfactory. I participated in the Dayton process. We negotiated, the EU and the US, we negotiated with war criminals to stop the killing. And we ended up with a very imperfect arrangement under the Dayton Accords, but it ended a war. If you go back in history, the Korean War was enormously bloody, and it ended through negotiations. It ended at the demarcation line that it had started at, but 1 million casualties later. So I'm kind of on the realist side about this, that we are going to have to think about that. But the last thing you want to do is undermine Ukraine's defenses, even if you believe that ultimately there will have to be a ceasefire. So this was absolutely imperative, and I'm relieved that it happened. And for me, it's a sign that, you know, after Americans exhaust all the other options, they finally do the sensible thing. So I'm quite relieved about that and encouraged.
Marlène?
Yeah, I think Eva wanted to.
Oh, Eva.
No, I just wanted to point out that for Austria, of course, this is an extremely relevant issue. And there's a geographical fact. You mustn't forget that Uzhgorod is closer to Vienna than Bregenz. Yeah? So we are very immediate neighbors to Ukraine. And we have taken an enormous amount of refugees from Ukraine who are also a factor here. Our overall consensus is at the moment that you cannot let Ukraine fall. Yeah? This would have consequences destabilizing the European continent of enormous proportions. Sooner or later, it will have to come to an agreement, but that is going to take quite a long time. And I wanted to add a final word on what you just talked about China. I think the problem of the European Union is the cumbersome decision processes, that it takes so long to work out a common position. If you have, especially in China, if you have now 27 countries with divergent economic interests in China and divergent security interests, but one overriding concern, let's not be drawn into any military confrontation with China. Yeah? And under that umbrella, sort of, they are trying to forge out a common position. It's going to take a very long time. But Ukraine is an issue that is very close to our national interest.
Marlène?
Yeah, if I can add, I think, so of course the European perspective is that it's Ukraine who should decide at which moment they feel they are ready to sit at the table of negotiation for a ceasefire. And the fear is that, as Kim was saying, if Trump is elected and kind of find an agreement with Putin, then Zelensky will probably not agree with that, and we will be left alone with the Europeans, kind of helping Ukraine in case US stop supporting it. So that's one of the issues. But I think you also have very strong kind of domestic issues that are at play actually in Ukraine. Right, that it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to be able to mobilize. So the question is also at which moment the Ukrainian society will see its own fatigue demographically, economically, and how that will play into Zelensky's capacity or whoever else around him to be there and put at the table this kind of difficult moment of always unsatisfactory ceasefire. And then I think the long-term European perspective is that it's not because you have a ceasefire that the war will stop. Right? I mean, it will stop, but then what if there is a second step? What if there is a second war in a few years? Depending what will be happening in Russia, depending how Ukraine will kind of rebuild itself, Europe will have to be prepared, or at least that should be part of the possible scenario about the war can come back again on Ukrainian territory, potentially on European territory, and that's the moment where what we were discussing, this capacity of Europe to have a strong European defense that would be autonomous from the US, also in terms of its own military capacity production, because I think what we were mentioning is that if you want to tell European weapons manufacturer, they need to invest a lot of money and training people right now because it's urgent, you need to make a commitment that we will be buying their weapons for the forthcoming decades, because these things are not over 12 months, it's over a decade. Right? So there is this always tension and difficulties of the European side to be able to commit to our own kind of production and say, okay, we will be continuing, even if there is a ceasefire, we have entered into an era where we will be spending a lot of money on our military kind of Cold War time, and that will be for the next decade because war can erupt again. We don't know what will happen in Russia. There can be a second war in Ukraine even after a ceasefire. So all this kind of ideological transformation, I think they are slowly arriving, but they are still not there. And it's very difficult for a politician to tell your public opinion. I mean, as a leader, we are a democratic country. It's much more difficult in wartime. How do you explain public opinion that after COVID, after inflation, in all this kind of difficult economic time, we will have to put a lot of money on the defense sector? Very difficult to sell politically, especially when we have election coming on. So,
Mark?
Yeah.
If I may,
do feel free to clap, by the way, if you feel so inclined.
I'll clap too. On this point, I think this is really key because we're talking about the US election. So it's also the politics of the policies. And it's important to understand that the 2016 and 2020 elections were both run against the backdrop of 20 years of failed military expeditions in the Middle East. And we had mainstream American politicians criticizing the so-called forever wars. I don't think it was Trump who even came up with that. And both Biden and Trump promised to withdraw from Afghanistan as part of their campaign pledges. And Biden ultimately did it. He then paid a political price. His polling numbers, Biden's, have never recovered from the day after the US withdrew from Kabul. We all remember the images. So it put him in a bit of a trap because Americans seemed to want to put an end to the forever wars, but they also don't like the look of defeat. And Biden confronts many challenges of that kind. And keep in mind that those interventions were sold by many of the same pundits and experts who are still writing today, and they used the same metaphors. They said these were existential wars, and if we didn't fight them, if we didn't overthrow Saddam Hussein, he would invade other countries, and down the line. My point is, I'm not making a policy point, although I could. I'm making a political point. The people have heard this before. And one codicil, there are places we are not paying attention to that are at war today. I flew to Vienna from the Horn of Africa yesterday. Ethiopia is just coming out of a couple of years of civil war with hundreds of thousands of casualties, perhaps millions of people on the verge of famine as a result of that war. Sudan is at war, civil war, with outside forces playing roles. Untold numbers of people have died, been injured, and again are on the verge of famine. So this is something else that is in the inbox. You can't always pick and choose the wars you want to pay attention to. And I would say to all my European friends, and again as part European, be careful about Eurocentrism. That's where there is a difference. The US really does have global exposure. It thinks about the Asia-Pacific in ways that Europe does not think about. We think about Latin America in ways you do not think about. And that's natural. But those do not assume an identity of interests or perspectives.
I want to bring together a couple of things. Partly, Marlène, that you mentioned about Europe has to make a decision about whether it's going to rearm, whether it's going to up its weapons production, and so on. We had just a couple of years ago Olaf Scholz talking about the Zeitenwende and the commitment to funnel 100 billion euros into defense. And yet that, it's been striking in our discussion here that we've barely mentioned Germany. Germany at the very center of Europe, so much depends on its economy, so much depends on its political leadership. And yet, am I wrong in thinking that Germany's kind of absent at the moment? Eva, you're a German speaker.
I'm a German speaker, but Austrian and not German.
That's why I said you were only a German speaker.
No, I think it's quite. First of all, Germany has a lot of internal problems at the moment, political problems that have to be resolved, that in a way act like sort of a millstone. Yeah, in sort of looking beyond Germany. I think, and Marlène has pointed it out very clearly, the country in Europe with the most European perspective at the moment is France, who has really sort of European security interests and European international interests in its mind frame. Yeah. And that the German-French relationship was a little bit difficulty in the last years. I mean, the times when President Mitterrand and Chancellor Kohl stood hand in hand, the battlefield of Verdun, are past. Yeah, the relationship is not without problems, but we all hope, and I think that's also a big question in the economic development, that sooner or later Germany will get its act together and become a player again.
So it's a sort of wait and see moment. Possibly, I suppose, the US presidential election might act as a wake-up call in Germany. Yeah. Kim?
I note two things on Germany at the moment. Number one, they are about to become, as they increase their defense expenditure, the second biggest defense spender in NATO. We've always had that title behind the biggest European defense spender, but I think Germany overtakes us when they live up to the promises that Chancellor Scholz has made about where he's taking German defense spending. And that's going to be quite a moment, which, by the way, with it will carry consequences for some of the top jobs in NATO that used to be reserved for British generals and might not be so anymore. Second point, I think that Germany has done better. We've been saying, diplomats and ministers to our German counterparts for a decade that they shouldn't be so dependent on Russian oil and gas. Actually, they have, particularly in the case of oil, less so on gas, they have lessened their dependency quite dramatically, quite quickly, much faster than a lot of us thought would be possible. Alongside all this, you have Chancellor Scholz sounding, to me, deeply reluctant about all of those policies. And that kind of limits the impact of what he's achieved, because he sounds like he's done it under external pressure and he really didn't want to do it at all. Actually, some of us would say Germany has done better than we've expected in terms of responding to what's going on in Ukraine. Again, on the Leopard tanks for Ukraine, he sounded reluctant for a long, long time, then did the right thing then. So I think Germany's kind of doing the right thing, but with such a show of visible reluctance that the impact of it has been reduced. Of course, as Eva says, they have lots of economic problems. Although from sitting in the UK, we can't look at other European countries and say, oh, they have really big problems, but they're problems we face.
There are a couple of areas I want to discuss before we go. This is one which is more local, and that is the Balkans and the Western Balkans in particular, because as we know, Trump had a very different policy, particularly on Serbia and Kosovo, than the Biden administration has demonstrated over the past 3.5 years. Is this, and here Europe again has shown its inability to act coherently, probably in its own interests when it comes to the issue of enlargement into the Balkans. In the past week or so, people have been muttering again that there's the possibility of problems in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and there's also slight anxiety around the situation between Kosovo and Serbia. Mark, is this an area that could turn radically different after November, were Trump to win?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think it could actually turn more difficult even before November, that there's a risk that various actors locally in the Balkans decide that this is the time to push the envelope. And they could be provoked by other countries that bear ill will, that want chaos. Right? You remember in my 3, the smarter machines, angrier people, nastier enemies. So enemies are trying to light fires wherever they can, not just in the Balkans. Look what's happening in the Red Sea corridor. This is all part of the same pattern of trying to escalate tensions, make life more difficult, perhaps take advantage of American distraction and European distraction. This is the big moment we're in, is that it really looks as though the leaders of Russia and China studied the situation in the US and Europe and decided that the West is in decline, and this is the moment to push things, right? Remember the unlimited partnership that Putin and Xi Jinping announced. Of course, there are limits, but still the spirit of it was really directed at perceived weakness, indecision, and chaos in the West, in the transatlantic alliance, and in the US in particular. So yes, I would watch out for flashpoints in this period. If Trump comes back, it could be even more chaotic.
And you mentioned the Middle East. I mean, it's interesting on some areas like the Houthis and the Red Sea and the access to the Suez Canal, of course. That's not necessarily in China's interest that there is trouble there, because it's so important for China to have unfettered access, particularly to European markets. And so is there also a way of looking at it that actually the Chinese-Russian relationship or the Chinese-Iranian relationship is not necessarily as sort of ironclad and clear as it might seem from the outside? Marlène?
Yeah, I don't think we should imagine them kind of working closely together, right? It's not a partnership. It's parallel strategies that sometimes overlap, but each of them have their own strategies, and they are not necessarily coordinated. They just go in the same direction of trying to kind of change the world order and the Western supremacy. So indeed, there is no agreement on everything. There is just this capacity at not fighting with each other because they have one bigger enemy, which is the kind of Western world order. And that's where I think this kind of perceived weakness of the West, where I think it's more than perceived. I think there is genuine doubts in our societies about the liberal democratic model in which we live. And if we are not able to address that genuine doubt that is grassroots, homegrown from our own societies, we will become a kind of object of external pressure, but the core issue is maybe not the external pressure. The core issue is happening in our own societies, and we need to address that if we don't want to be victim of a kind of external pressures.
Kim?
Just a couple of points on Russia-China. You'll remember that just before the Winter Olympics in Beijing, Putin went to see President Xi, and we think told him about the forthcoming invasion, this 2022 invasion
the
of
4-day invasion.
Ukraine. And I think told him it'll be over in a couple of weeks, so don't worry about it. And I think Xi said, well, just don't do it till we've got through the Olympics. And I think the Chinese, they made a strategic error in agreeing to back it. I think that they would wish it was over, that it was over months and months or a year ago, and they feel rather trapped now. And I noticed that, first of all, they've put out, it's not a very good piece of paper, but they put out a sort of peace proposal, which is just basically a set of proposals, which I don't think is what the Russians necessarily would have wanted them to do. Second, there has been quite notably a public statement that, of course, there should be no use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And again, I'm not sure that's meant to be terribly helpful to Putin. So I think you see a few signs that the Chinese will continue broadly to let the Russians do what they're doing in Ukraine, but there are limits, and there are, I think, messages going to Russia about how to do this. And if this thing drags on and on and on, it wouldn't surprise me to see some Chinese pressure to actually finish it.
Eva, what I'm taking away from this discussion, and we're coming to an end, we've got actually less than 5 minutes to go, but what I'm taking away is that whatever happens in November, Europe really needs to improve its decision-making capacity, its ability to react to global events. And so it is facing a fundamental domestic challenge of how the European Union works. Do you think that the 27 have the capacity, the capability in order to meet these challenges, which, as we've heard today, are very fundamental?
I think that's a very good summary of the situation. And I'm very glad that Mark also brought in the perspective of sort of the wider worldly turmoil that around us. Conflict areas where Europe has no clout whatsoever. But we have no impact what's happening in Sudan. We have no impact what's happening in the Horn of Africa.
Middle East.
Middle East. We are completely out as an actor in the Middle East. Payer, yes, but player, no. Yeah? In answer to your question, I think definitely the capacity would be there. Everybody knows when you talk in discussions what needs to be done, which direction it should be going. The question is really, where is the political will to really sit down and do it? And who is going to take the lead in it? Yeah? That's also a question. Who is at the moment the European politician who has enough standing and enough determination to carry that through? The capacity would be there, that's no question.
So it's the political will. Final thoughts from the other three. I'll go in the reverse direction. Kim?
Or whether Europe has the capacity.
Any other observations that you have, preferably if there's any possibility of a little bit of hope. It might improve everyone's mood as they go out into this gorgeous spring day.
If you want some hope out there, that was, as Mark has said, a hugely important breakthrough to get this package of American aid to Ukraine. This gives Ukraine, which otherwise I think would have lost a significant chunk of territory this year, maybe lost the war, 6 months to a year's breathing space. I think Europe, if it gets its act together, can backfill quite a lot of what might be lost if Trump wins and actually stops weaponry for Ukraine. So suddenly the picture's gone from really quite bleak there, where it looked like Ukraine was on a slow path to defeat, to one where you can see them at least holding what they hold, and perhaps at some point in the near future, particularly as they get better trained and better used to using some of the high-quality weapons that we're giving them from the West, particularly they can make some advances. And so I think Putin's had a big setback in the last week, and it's not before time, and that gives me a little bit of hope. The other thing I think is although we're nowhere near our objectives on climate change, and if Trump wins, he will take America out of the Paris deal, and that will be bad for everyone. I'm just impressed by the advances we're making in science and some of the things that we can do there that are going to help us in the fight against climate change, by the pressure that comes from pretty much everyone under 40 to do more on this. And so I'm more hopeful about climate change, about tackling climate change than I was 5 or 10 years ago.
Thanks, Kim. Marlène?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can be as optimistic. I think democracy are really tested when you have polycrisis, right? When you are in a polycrisis situation, and that's what we have now. And a polycrisis means that it's very difficult for all the political actors to try to find the right language to their own citizen, because it's very difficult when you are a citizen to accept this kind of polycrisis and to understand that you can be impacted on so many aspects that seems very far geographically or far in time from your everyday life, but decisions have to be taken now. So I think it's really an extremely challenging time. And to go back on the climate change, I think that the more we talk about geopolitical conflict, the less we are moving on environmental issues. And that's one of the contradictions that I think we see now in Europe with the Green Deal and the difficulties at moving forward, is that we are dealing with so many kind of urgent issues that we also tend to postpone what seems as a long-term issue while it's also a kind of emergency. So this kind of multi-emergency situation is really kind of pushing Europe at its maximum to kind of reinvent itself and find a way to be functional.
Marlène and Mark, final word from you.
Well, I think my colleagues have spoken so well. I think we're confronting human nature right now. It was Solzhenitsyn who wrote that the line between good and evil runs through every individual soul. And I think the hope today actually lies in the possibility that we're all looking into the abyss. We're coming from different perspectives, we have different interests, but we're looking into the abyss and have a new understanding of just how bad things could become, and that we will pull back from the brink.
Thank you, Mark. Before we go, I'd like to thank all of our collaborators. all of our collaborators in the series, in the Europe series that we've had here at the Burgtheater, particularly the backstage staff at the Burgtheater who work so hard on a Sunday morning to ensure that, that this happens. But a special thanks to my 4 panelists who have outlined just how serious the challenges that we face are, but also we've heard at the end, there are ways forward, and it's a little bit too early to despair. And so a round of applause for everyone, please. Thank you.